I am delighted to welcome you today to the May 2016 program of the University of Chicago, Chicago's Women's Alliance Affinity Group, entitled Serious Games for Serious Problems, presented by Dr. Melissa Gilliam. My name is Carla Funk, and I'm the president of the Chicago Women's Alliance. Now, this is a special program in several ways. This year, CWA is celebrating our 10th anniversary of providing a group for you Chicago alumni and all women affiliated with the university to come together and learn and connect. In that 10 years, we have expanded from our original group in Chicago to include metro groups in New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Now, we offer a variety of opportunities for members and others, including programs such as this one, geographic lunches, dinners where we discuss topics of interest, theater events, the list goes on. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Melissa Gilliam, Professor of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Pediatrics, Director of CI3, and Dean for Diversity and Inclusion at the University of Chicago Medicine. Dr. Gilliam.
So good afternoon, everyone, and I appreciate you being here on such a beautiful day. It's hard to compete. Today I'm going to talk about the work that we do at CI3, and we just use the initials because it's rather hard to pronounce. I've been at the University of Chicago for about 10 years, and the reason I started in obstetrics and gynecology is really because of my interest in teen pregnancy. When I came, and started practicing, I was finishing residency in about 2000, and it's around the time when teen pregnancy had just been very, very high, and the rates have continued to come down. And at that time, it was this really pressing issue, and I had actually been in general surgery, and I had planned to be a cancer doctor, and I thought, no, my real passion is around adolescents. The first study I did was actually one in which I did an intervention, and it was all the things that you're supposed to do when you do an intervention. I involved young people in the development. We used videos, we used digital media, we used lots of behavioral theories. And the idea, and at that time I was at Northwestern, was to try to prevent the second repeat pregnancy to adolescent mothers. I thought I'd focus on a second pregnancy because that first pregnancy, it's kind of complex for why teens become pregnant the first time. But anyone who's had a baby or been involved with a baby knows that right after delivery, you don't want to be pregnant again within a year. And so that seemed like a real time of motivation. At the time, the main birth control method available was birth control pills and an injection. And I was going to work with young people who chose birth control pills because those were the methods that were hard to use. When I started following them, however, I ended up seeing so many of them get pregnant again. The funny thing was, most of our counseling happens at 6 weeks when people come back for their 6-week visit. But what was so surprising is that only about a third of them ever came back. Instead, knowing that they could reach me, they called me all the time and they said things like, my phone has gotten cut off, the elevator doesn't work, and I live in Cabrini Green and I can't get down 10 flights of steps. They weren't showing up. And so it wasn't that my intervention was bad. I would have thought that because about a third of them were pregnant again within a year. It was that we hadn't paid any attention to the structural factors in their lives, right? We didn't really understand our population, even though we saw them all the time when they came to deliver. And so that made me realize that we sit in this beautiful environment, these hospitals, and that's where people bring their best selves, but we don't know that much about their everyday life. And when we sit there, we might have our hypothesis about our own Chicago, right? This is a Chicago that many of us live and work in and visit. And if you think about architecture and the strength and vitality it gives us to live in a beautiful setting, that really empowers us, right? And that's why we try to surround ourselves with beauty and why college campuses are so beautiful. But there are other Chicagos, right? And there are Chicagos that do not support you and do not give you and do not empower you. And so the second study I did was actually to follow a cohort of adolescent mothers. And what we did was we would drive and we'd visit them in their homes at 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And we do long interviews where we really tried to understand everything about their lives. And that was the insight. And I did this when I was a resident. And so I was completely poisoned because I suddenly realized that we can't practice clinical medicine without really understanding the populations that we're working with. And we can't think about just changing individual behavior. We have to think about the larger systems and structures. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is sort of this changing way in which I've started working with adolescents. And a lot of this has happened through CI3. What's been wonderful about being trained as a physician and a public health person is that in medicine, we really learn to work in groups and in teams. And then we solve the problem that a patient brings to us. And so the problem that I started wondering about was not so much just pregnancy. And if you remember my previous slide, pregnancy rates are coming down. We're at the lowest rate of adolescent pregnancy that we've ever been at. About 250,000 fewer adolescents became pregnant last year, right? Smaller than almost any major statistic you're going to think of. Except, are their lives so much better, right? And that's really the question. But like most teenagers, you don't approach them with problems, right? You approach them with hope and optimism. And so what I'd propose is that we really have a crisis of imagination when we think about the future. If I think about my own son and daughter, my husband right now is taking my son to visit to some kind of pre-college awareness thing, right? You know, we pump all of this energy into each of us, and we look for the potential. There are other kids who don't have those opportunities. And then I want to pose another concept to you. It's called syndemics, which is that, you know, when we think of a problem, we think about it in isolation, the way that I first told you about my own introduction to teen pregnancy. But teen pregnancy doesn't happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen in isolation. It happens with a lot of other social problems. Syndemics was originally a term that was coined to start to think about why African-American men who have sex with men are so much more prone to HIV and why those rates are so hard to eradicate. But with time, we realized that lots of things have syndemic behaviors: teen pregnancy, poor education, sexually transmitted infections, and they act synergistically and have kind of a downward spiral. And so these were the things that I was starting to think about. As much as I loved medicine, I realized not all of the tools and resources I needed sat in the walls of a medical center. And so I used this map to symbolize, one, that I'm quite nerdy, but also two, the number of partners that I was able to find at the University of Chicago and in the community as I started to think about starting a center that could use other approaches and work with other disciplines to think about the health and well-being of adolescents. And from this map and all of these different people that I met, we created this conference. And this is us sitting at the Gleacher Center. And I like this slide because at the front, you might even notice some of these people. At the front, we have someone from the Divinity School and then the Law School, and then Tim Knowles, who was at the Urban Education Institute at the time, and then Alita Burris from SSA, and then next to her an economist, and then Dr. Voisin from SSA. And around the room were people from everywhere, from Chapin Hall to the medical center to the law school and the business school, so people from lots of discipline. And what we used that day to do was to say, how can we all come together and work in different ways to support the health of young people? And that conference ended up as CI3. And CI3 was really a way of helping us explain that, yeah, we can collaborate in a way that leads to change in the lives of young people. So this is a schematic that just gives you a way of thinking about CI3. It's actually kind of hard to suddenly, from the medical center, start talking to somebody in the humanities and find a shared language. And so the thing we landed upon was this idea of making things together. If you collaborate on a project, it forces you to communicate. If you write something together, you start to create a shared language. And that's one of the challenges with transdisciplinary research, is you actually almost need new language and new words to do it. And so what we ended up doing is creating 3 labs. One is the Game Changer Lab, and I'll spend the most time on that because that's the most well-established. We're a little over 3 years old now. We're about 3.5 years old, and it really was led by our work in narrative and game. The second lab is our Transmedia Story Lab, and then more recently we're working on what we call the Design Thinking Lab. And then each of these has cross-cutting programs in research, policy, and communications. CI3 is a youth-facing lab. Everything we do, when we say, who is our audience? What are we trying to do? It's always make the lives of young people better. And so the way we do that is through this work. And so the first lab is called the Transmedia Story Lab. And I discovered narrative as actually one of the first projects that we did. And it was amazing. I spent all of my time talking to adolescents, and I talked to them about very personal things. But suddenly, when you go outside of that clinic visit where you only have 15 minutes to talk to them and another 15 with their parents and then another 15 to tell them what they have to do, when you actually spend days with adolescents and create a safe space for them to have conversations about things that really matter, suddenly you realize you're getting at all of the things that are actually driving the behaviors you see in clinic. They're talking about their relationships with their families. They're talking about their relationships with their communities and with their peers. And that is what drives risk behaviors, not necessarily that they didn't know something or they didn't think about something. And so stories have become very powerful. It's also really transformed the way that we've done research. And I use this term authentic research, maybe to get away from what I described at the beginning, where it was a hypothesis based on what I had read in a book, but I had never really explored the lives of young people. And at this time, I think this type of authentic research that really understands the lives that young people are living and what they're dealing with is really important because of the violence and trauma that young people feel. And so what we think about is that when trauma happens, when violence happens, it's really quite senseless, right? It takes what your sort of sense of who you are and this holistic sense that you have and sense of integrity, and it really disrupts it because suddenly you have a loss of control. The therapeutic tradition of story and narrative is to externalize something, and then it becomes manageable again. And so we talk about how narrative restores meaning. I will actually, if this will work, I'll show you an example of the types of stories that we've created. And this story comes from a project called Southside Stories. And this was funded by the Ford Foundation, and it allowed us to work with a number of organizations on the south side of Chicago. And with those organizations, we trained them in storytelling, and then we helped to recruit young people and help them tell stories. And then we work with them, we teach them how to take photographs. We work in the Logan Center to teach them how to do video editing, how to use sound equipment, and they end up making short digital narratives about major events in their lives. So this is an example from Southside Stories.
To be called beautiful and gorgeous was a new experience. And for that, he became my savior, the one who understood me. Before meeting him, I was the black sheep, never feeling pretty, never feeling beautiful. He pushed those words to life, made me feel wanted, happy to be loved and be loved by him. I am watching this situation as if it isn't even me. I'm watching her underneath him, panting, crying, pleading for him to stop, too weak to fight, too scared to scream. I want to ask her, how did you get into this situation? I want to ask him, if she's so beautiful, how could you do this? They can't answer. I walk down the street alone, listening to music, as the cool evening air touches my face. I look at the clock, almost 10, and I'm 3 blocks away from the bus stop at 60th and Cottage, when my walk was disrupted by the sound of determined footsteps. I glance over my shoulder. A man is following me. I cross the street. He crosses the street as well. I walk faster, and so does he. I search my bag for my knife. It isn't there. Is this happening? Without thinking, I began to run until the sound of my footsteps take over the music. I am watching the situation as if it isn't even me. a girl who looks like me, running and praying. Moments like this take you back. Trigger memories that leave you feeling stuck. For months and years, I've been running and hiding, praying with a knife by my side. You see, there are things a girl should always remember. Her first love, her first kiss, it should be a positive thing. But that's not her story. I run behind the tree and freeze on instinct. I look behind me and I see no one. The coast is clear, so I ran to the bus stop, constantly looking around. The wind no longer feels cool and pleasant. It becomes hard and stiff. It's past 10 o'clock now. There's this beautiful girl trapped inside of me, who is not running or scared of her dreams, not too scared to let anyone in, but to break free and fulfill that destiny. She has to let go of the past. She has to forgive. But who?
This young woman, that was the first time she had ever told that story. And so even just our location at a school with a School of Social Work and with lots of therapeutic options for her made a large difference. And my partner in this project is Dr. Burris at SSA. But it just gives you an example of the trauma that young people have experienced in our community and how few outlets and resources there are for them. So the other, and so these stories, for example, are used to create conversation and to, and we often have young people themselves present the stories. We've had opportunities to have young people present to students here on campus, really to talk about their experience of living on the South Side and sort of the differences in those experiences. And so so there's that therapeutic tradition that I described, but this also comes from a methodology around popular education and really starting to say, how do you take the people who are most affected by an issue and bring them into the process of telling their own stories and actually informing the research. And so our idea is that this is really transformational, not only to them, but also to those of us who hear these stories. The Transmedia Lab, our current project is in Uttar Pradesh, India. And so this is in conjunction with this number of organizations in India, but was really made possible by the fact that we have a Delhi Center here at the University of Chicago. And so we were able to make a number of trips there, and we were able to just create really the circumstances so that we could do this research. And so the woman in the dress there is Dr. Alicia Menendez from the Harris School, who is an economist who studies health and education and the educational impact. And this is this young woman, Harshita, is a member of our research team, and then one of our alums from the undergraduate who worked with us for 4 years is now living in India running this project. And so this is a house that we were able to rent and really create a space where we're using narrative and storytelling to understand issues of gender among girls living in slums in Uttar Pradesh. Okay. So I'm going to bracket stories for a second, and we're going to move to games. So the second area that we work in is in games. And I like to sort of think of stories as really being a way to deeply explore the world that we live in. But games are a way of us starting to think about the world that we'd like to see. So the work that I do in games is with my colleague in the humanities, Patrick Chigoda, who's in the Department of English. And games became this way of really playing with young people. So if you think about games, they have so many affordances. But one of the things about actually designing games is that it forces you to work together and to collaborate and figure out how teams work. And then at the end, you have something that you've made together. And so this type of thinking is called critical making. And this is this term is created by a person named Matt Ratto. He's a professor. And what he said is through designing and writing and collective storytelling, we can co-develop something in real time. And all that negotiation gives us a moment to critique and to think about major social issues in this world. And we take this really literally. It's really been one of the ways in which we've been able to go from the health fields to media and media making, is this idea of working and making something together. But when we added young people, suddenly we realized we had so many things that we hadn't, that we had just tapped into just a wealth of opportunity. So first of all, games really matter. Games are bigger than the music or the movie industry. It's a $15.4 billion industry, and this is actually an old figure. It's even bigger now. The other thing is young people play games, like all sorts of games, and all sorts of young people. So about 97% of people play video games, and it crosses gender, it crosses platform, it crosses race, ethnicity, sexual identity. So games are big. However, pretty much like media, the people who make games don't necessarily look like the people who play them. And so it is predominantly men and predominantly heterosexual men. And so we have diverse people playing it, but not diverse people making it. And the same if you look at issues of race, ethnicity. So the other thing about games is that they allow so many things. So if we think about, when I had little kids, what do? We played together, right? It's this way of creating this universal language, this way of crossing all sorts of boundaries. And yet when you play something, it gives you a tremendous sense of agency, and failing is normal, right? So in the game language, we call it grinding. The idea is just you make a mistake and you just try over and over and over again. When we look at research about what is it that really makes some people stand apart in education, right? It's the willingness to try again. I write tons of grants. The key to grant writing is to fail, get up, do it again, right? And so that resilience, that resourcefulness, that trying again, and someone like Angela Duckworth would call it grit, is inherent to games. And yet it doesn't have all of this tremendous sense of failure. Now, I showed you those two Chicagos. In one of those Chicagos, you step out of line, the consequences are huge, right? So you have a group of young people who are also really afraid of failure, right? It's incredible anxiety, incredibly careful about all of the things that are kind of in the back of their minds throughout their day. And so this idea of play, where there's forgetfulness and error and all of these other things, that's why we realize play has so much to offer. So I want to take you through a series of games, and then we'll do it by genre, and I'll talk to you about some of the lessons that we've learned. So the first I want to talk about is something called alternate reality games. Alternate reality games are sort of like the X-Files. It's sort of like you're walking through life and there could be this other reality, these little secrets, these little things you get bits of clues from. When we first imagined the alternate reality game we were going to design, we thought, we'll have kids wandering all over the city of Chicago and we'll send them little clues. And then we realized, probably not such a good idea. So then it ended up a little more like, we'll bring them all to the University of Chicago and we will run a summer camp and we will feed them and we will give them transportation and we will check them in and out every day. And that seemed like a better idea. And so that's what we did. We basically opened the campus up for 5 weeks. We invited 140 young people, and it was predominantly African American, some Latino, predominantly male, all high school students, all of them from the Chicago public schools. And we told them a story, which was, there's a young woman, her name is Adia, and she lives with her stepdad and her mother on the south side of Chicago. She's incredibly busy, and her parents always want her in school. One day, she walks into into her mother's room, and under the bed, she finds this envelope. And it's addressed to her, and it's from her estranged father. And it's an elaborate puzzle, and she needs to solve it. Well, she's too busy, so she needs a bunch of kids to help her. So Adia is considered the source, her estranged father, and that's the call to play. So throughout the week, they receive a series of videos, and these are called webisodes. And they're short videos, and then they're cut from popular media. And they're introduced to Adia, and this is the prologue in which she introduces herself, tells about this elaborate puzzle, and invites them to play. Now for us, we had 3 youth actors who did this. This young woman at the time was 14 years old and just an amazing actress. And they came throughout the summer via video and then also on social media so that they could hook kids in and they could respond to the things that were happening. Each day, they played games, challenging games. We created games in major museums, the Museum of Science and Industry, the Art Institute, and each week was dedicated to a theme. So we used the acronym STEAM, Science, Technology, Engineering, Art, and Math, and each week had one of those titles. But then we hooked it to a major theme. So one of the reasons why we think that young people of color are less likely to enter into higher academics, especially around science and technology, doesn't seem to relate to their lives. And they haven't met a lot of people who are doing that. So the other component was, one, to make sure that each theme was really relevant. So for example, if we did a week that had to do with science, it was epidemiology, sexually transmitted infections, math, cryptography, and a cold case, and they had to solve a big mystery. The other thing that we did was we made sure they met professionals throughout their time there. So they were meeting people from all of the different schools, all of the different professions. We also divided them into teams of 10, and they competed. They collaborated with one another, but competed against different teams. We even had a leaderboard so that they could see their points. And so each day they would come and they would be guided by either an undergraduate or a graduate student. We recruited students from across the country. And they came and they worked in those teams. And so it's called near-peer mentoring, so that they can see examples of what it is to be in college. And then they spent the whole time at the University of Chicago. So there were days when they would sit in a classroom and argue and have to debate a topic, or there'd be another time when they're out playing on a field. But throughout it, they're getting exposed to a college campus. Many of these young people lived as close as a mile from campus, and yet had never spent time on this campus, just to give you a sense of what the experience was like. The following summer, this is the same summer. This is at the Museum of Science and Industry. So many of them had never gone to the museum. So we created an elaborate scavenger hunt where they had to solve problems as teams. And then we made sure that everything was really hands-on and tactile. So we made sure that they're exposed to engineers and knew how to try things. And girls would say, "Oh my gosh, I always thought this was a career for boys." And they'd say, "But did you see this? It was all girls in this room." And so suddenly these young women were looking at fields and saying, maybe there is a place for us. We then follow them for 2 years. We meet them every 6 months to find out what happened to them and what happened to them as they went back to school. The other thing that we've worked on is board games. And so this is a board game that we initially developed for the game The Source, but we've used it subsequently. And the idea behind our board games is to start to help kids think about systems. And so this is one of our main games, which is called Hexacago. And it represents the city of Chicago with hexagon overlay. So you can kind of see the lake and the subway lines. But it becomes a way for young people to start to think about larger systems and structures. So not only is systems thinking a really critical 21st century skill, it begins to help them almost get a 30-foot view of their lives and start to realize that what we talk about all the time in the medical field, health disparities, and that same thing I was describing to you at the beginning, that there are structural factors that change people's lives starts to take that individual sense of blame and shame, and it helps them start to think about the larger system, how cities are structured, and even very simple concepts like transportation inequality, right? What happens if you live on the south side of Chicago and you try to actually get around the south side of Chicago? It wasn't until I really started playing games on the Hexicago board that I started realizing that it's not that a patient that comes from the suburbs has this really long journey and the patient who lives a mile away has a short one. The public transportation is so difficult, and even just to cross from one side of the south side to the other is so challenging. It is actually really formidable to just get to our clinical setting. And so that convenience of doing everything in the same day is as important for a person who lives nearby as someone who is driving. But we don't think about the structure and the systems that people live in. And so this game, this board is a place for young people to design games, but also to play the games that we design. And so this has led to something we call the Hexicago Health Academy, in which young people come and design games with us. We teach them to design games. And we use it as an excuse to pump their heads full of all sorts of research. They have to go to the library, they have to read, they have to debate, they have to interview professors, and they have to get lots of information to design a game. And they want to be authorities on the game, so they get really excited. And so these are just a couple of games that they prototyped. And then we take the games and we start to finesse them. And so it might start off a little more rudimentary, and by the time we're done, it looks fancy, and then we'll bring it into the next summer program. We've also gotten really excited about digital games. And so if you'll recognize this as this is the front of the lab school. But this became the basis for a game that we're working on right now around sexual assault. And so teachers have a lot of trouble broaching these ideas. And so one thing that was really important is that we had a teacher in the game that basically took the burden of discussion away from the teachers. And so our character Virgil describes what sexual violence is and sexual misconduct. As we play tested with kids, they told us the things that they had trouble, like the questions that they had, and so we put them in the game. So this is called bystander. And they were like, well, doesn't a bystander mean you're just watching, standing by? And even though this is a very well-studied type of intervention, we needed to answer that question. So we put it in the game. And so bystander has 4 components, where young people interact and they have to solve problems. In every game that we design, we always put young people in a position of agency. You're never the victim, you're always the person who's the problem solver. And so the idea is, in this scene, is you go around and you kind of find episodes of sexual harassment and you define them. And so he looks at the different episodes and then you can go into the different windows. When we talked to them, they said, it's not always male on female. So we want you also to understand that sexual violence happens to young men. So in this one, you again support the friend who's had an experience of sexual assault. And in it, you use the cell phone where you find different information and you fill in the blanks, and it really promotes knowledge as well as skills around identifying resources. Another scene deals with the issue of date rape. And so in this one, you play, it's Holly and Gina. And so one is Gina's had this experience where she was had an episode of date rape, and your idea and the goal for you is to support her as a friend. Now, you get to make a choice about what you do. In all games, you get to make mistakes. So we actually give the wrong answer. And young people said, I don't really know what I would do, so can we also have an option of keep listening? So we put that in, but also the right answer. You then give her your response. If you give the right answer, she sort of responds to you, and she's like, yeah, thank you. And then she sort of confirms what you say. And then she goes on to the next one. And again, you go through and have the option of giving her an answer. So those are examples of our games. I'm going to finish by talking about our third lab, which is kind of an emerging one. We have one project in the field and are starting to expand. So I talked to you about that issue of the 2 Chicagos. And one of those is, one thing that helps us to understand that is the term syndemics, but the other is structural violence. And this is a term that comes from Paul Farmer, who is a public health practitioner at Harvard. And the idea is that some structures really embolden us, give us a sense of well-being, but other structures are actually harmful. They affect violence on our lives. And it's not just kind of a social science term, there's biologic reality, and it's really around the anxiety and the stressors that environments and living in danger causes. And in that, we elevate cortisol levels, and in that, we know that it leads to shorter life expectancy, cancers, and other problems. And so really, the idea is that these structures contribute to health disparities. When I described the medical system that really wasn't paying attention to the fact that teenagers don't come back, one of the issues is that we designed the medical system through our own eyes with the idea of helping the highest risk patient, the highest risk pregnancy, but we didn't really think about prevention. If you had actually walked in the shoes of adolescents and you had asked them what the hospital experience was like for them, you'd have designed a very different system. And so these ideas have to do with design. And so the other area that we work in is design, right? How do you design a system where the end user is actually taken into account? And this has been wonderful for many, many industries that are looking at issues of safety and quality. They really design for those outcomes, but we don't always design thinking about the human experience. So if you had a 3-year-old come to your house, you'd say, oh my gosh, and you'd crawl around your house and you'd look for every danger point and you'd make sure that house was receptive. But we don't really do that for healthcare. We don't really do that for young people. And so our idea is that if you bring people into this process of designing your interventions, we're far more likely for those interventions to stick. So one of my colleagues at CI3 is working on the idea of pre-exposure prophylaxis, which is PrEP therapy for people at high risk of HIV. I talked to you briefly about the fact that there are incredibly high rates of HIV among men who have sex with men, especially African American, in our communities on the South Side. And so his idea was to create a counseling app in which we teach young people about these methods, but to bring them in, because if you have very low literacy rates, you've got to design an intervention that really meets those needs. And so what he learned was by doing interviews with young people, first of all, in just this very small population, a fifth of them were HIV positive. Very small study, but of the people he brought in, randomly brought them in, really high rates of HIV. A number of my colleagues have done similar work, and the HIV positivity rate is still very consistent, usually about 20%. But when you talk to the young people, you create personas and you really think through what is their experience. What he realized is they needed imagery. And so we have artists in our lab and we drew these beautiful apps, and this app will now get trialed in clinic. My obsession is with that transportation. I told you about that. So my obsession is the fact that it is really hard for adolescents to come to clinic. There are all sorts of issues of confidentiality and privacy, but transportation is huge. And it also means that parents have to get out of work. It means kids miss school. And so the people who make it to my clinic here at the university, those are the ones with the most self-efficacy. So we started speaking to the people at the Comer Mobile Health Unit who have a health unit that actually goes to schools. And I said, well, do you all actually provide reproductive health care? And they said minimal. What we'd really like to do is provide family planning care, but we just don't know how. We don't have the skills. We don't have the drugs and the medications. So we're like, let's design together. So this is the beautiful Comer Mobile Health Unit, and one of our fellows has now worked with them for a year and a half, and they're now providing contraceptive services. And we worked with the nurses, and we worked with a group of adolescents, and we put big tape on the floor, and we walked through, and we really conceptualized what does a mobile health unit mean? What affordances does it have versus a clinic? And how do we actually design a system that we can start to deliver healthcare in the community? So we partner all of this with research and policy and communication. Our research we have to even figure out, well, how do you even study a game? And what's the methodology for studying a game? And then we also do applied research. We do randomized controlled trials of some of our interventions, and we also evaluate the efficacy. A lot of our work also hits policy because it's incredibly important not to just try something, but you have to change the systems in order to make it sustainable. So we work with policymakers at the state and at the national level and at the local level to really make sure that what we do is sustainable. And then because we're academics, we do a lot of publications, but it's really funny. We're now published in things from the medical literature to the education to the play literature. So it's been a pretty interesting academic ride as well. So I'll leave you with just some of the big questions that we continue to ask. One is, how do we map and assess the outcomes of the things that are actually meaningful to communities? I'd suggest that sometimes the things that we look for as academics or public health practitioners or just generally well-meaning citizens are not always the same outcomes that are meaningful to people who are living in a particular community. And I think as a research institution, we have the ability to create these really interesting ways of assessment, and that they should be more dynamic and open to things that matter to the individuals and especially to adolescents. We talk a lot about how do we shift from a sense of hopelessness to really expand our framework for thinking about the future of young people, one that is full of wellness and possibility and hope, that isn't contingent on the color of your skin or the class or the neighborhood that you were born into. And then I talk a lot about diversity and inclusion. And as we think about young people and how many we lose along the way to issues of health, issues of violence, issues to just despair, this idea of really thinking about the importance of having these young people in our institutions and in our lives and all that they have to contribute. So I will end by thanking all of the members of CI3 who really reach out to faculty and staff all over the campus and in the community, and obviously, as you can tell, in the world, to get the work that we do done. And then I'll thank you all for listening.